Mr. Sunga, nice to have you here in the Global Living Room.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming. Davor, nice to see you again.
Good to be here, as always.
Mr. Sunga, as an expert for the topic of migration refugees, I would like that we maybe start with this topic that used to be a hot topic until a few months ago. Then COVID simply covered it, and now it will maybe re-emerge. But in general, to understand, what's your opinion about the treatment of the refugees, Africa, Middle East, coming to Europe in general? Are they really protected subjects of international humanitarian law in the first place? Or could we say that they are primarily and in the first place objects of some international power game? What is this identity?
Yeah, thanks. No, I wouldn't frame it exactly in that way as a one or the other. And just to be a bit more precise with this, in international human rights law establishes very firmly, very clearly, as a matter of jus cogens, which means it's a peremptory norm that overrides all other norms of international law. There's certain classes of international law norms that every individual on earth, that includes you and me, has a right to seek asylum in a foreign country. I think the reason for that hardly needs stating, but it is that if you're facing a well-founded fear of persecution from your own government or government, you're in the territory, and the governmental authority or the authority that's there starts to target you or persecute you for maybe your political opinions, your ethnicity, or for whatever reason, you have, as a matter of your individual human rights, regardless of treaties that the state, your state, or another state has signed, it's part of customary international law. It's part of the unwritten code of international law that's not disputed at all. You have a right to seek asylum. So then, that opens up a lot of different questions. There's a difference between individuals seeking asylum, and in which case they have to either prove that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, which can be sometimes difficult to prove, or depending on the state, some states are much more welcoming and say, listen, if you're fleeing from generalized violence or war or natural disaster, for example in Syria, you may not be being specifically targeted, but you still are at great risk of life, limb, and liberty being taken away, that you should be protected, at least till the danger passes. So, nothing of that is, I would say, is controversial. It's very well established in international law. What I think is, the difficult questions arise when we talk about economic migrants. Some people may be wanting to just leave their own countries because there's very bad unemployment, or they're looking for better opportunities. Economic migrants don't have the same rights as refugees. The thing I'd like to underline before we go on to your other questions is that at least a person shouldn't be turned away back to their country where they're facing a danger. So let there be a refugee determination process. That is what international law demands. That is what the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees determination process recommendations are, that people should be judged, there should be a determination process individually to determine whether the claims are real or not. And then, if a person is being targeted, or if they're fleeing perhaps from generalized violence, or they're under threat, then it should be let in and taken care of, because that's a basic human rights, basic humanitarian consideration, if you like. So whether they are also, this was part of your question, are they also part of the power politics and is it a political issue and all these things? Anything that's a serious issue that voters care about is a political issue. It has to be decided by the public decision-making bodies, by the legislature and by the executive, etc., etc. So, of course, these are inescapably also political issues. That doesn't mean that they're completely just a matter of politics. There's law involved here, and the law is very clear, as I stated. That there is a right to non-refoulement, which is not to be turned back. It's a legal obligation on every single state. And domestic considerations do not provide an excuse for that. That's also very well established in international law. What are they an object of political considerations? Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's true for a lot of different issues, humanitarian issues. I would rather say they're, the subject of debates and humanitarian consideration, power politics. That often does figure into it when you have large refugee outflows, when you have conditions that big powers may be creating by bombing the hell out of a country or another, and that creates refugee outflows. Or one country like Turkey decides, saying, "Listen, we're going to open our borders because you're not giving us the deal that we, you're not honoring the deal that we thought we had with the EU, etc., etc." Those are all political maneuvers. They're not very nice. They are using refugees as pawns, and so I just leave it at that at this stage.
And since, to be honest, the whole international law concerning refugees and the right to be protected was somehow is a concept of a situation where we are thinking about individuals or some numbers of individuals coming. However, when it starts with the masses really coming, then the political climate in Europe was significantly changed in the past years. So after the Willkommenpolitik started was initialized by Mrs. Merkel, we had a backlash in Europe, and since then we are living with this backlash. However, this wave was insignificant compared to the number of Europeans living in the EU, completely insignificant. We are talking about 0 point something percentages or 0.0 something. We still do have stories about threats, about replacements, and this was really an interesting point for me. How the international, what's your opinion, would the international law survive this serious backlash of political pressure? Is it resilient enough to survive? What happens if we have so many countries in EU simply rejecting to honor their obligation?
International law is not a regime that exists over and above the will of states. It cannot be reduced to political will, and political. It has some kind of objective existence in terms of norms, because that's what the objectified consensus is among states. But if states do not, in general, decide to follow international law, it could, over the long term, start to undermine international law as an institution. And we can talk about it with regard to refugees, or with regard to the use of force, with regard to many different areas. So obviously, the more that legal norms, whether at the domestic level, or regional level, or international level, are followed, of course, then that tends to strengthen the institutions. If there is widespread, neglect or deliberate breaching of the law, then at a certain point, if it becomes very widespread, then you might consider that international law, being a weak system, is not being followed in the main. But I want to make one point, and that is that legal norms at any level, just because they are broken doesn't mean they don't exist. So yes, the EU can. EU countries may start to have there's a backlash. There's been the Willkommen policy gave rise to some right-wing vocal dissent and even some violence, and these things can happen. But the norms are still out there, and they're still being followed in the main. Principally, they're being followed. But it's true. I mean, you raise a very good point, and that is that if the EU or other regional bodies, regional arrangements, if they speak one set of norms and then they don't follow them very well in practice, or these things then they start to break down a bit. But that's a longer game. That's a more you have to see quite a bit more before that happens. So I wouldn't say that international law is about to implode or about to dissolve, but certainly I'd like to see much more compliance of international legal norms across the board, for sure.
In this respect, I must say, so I will just hand over to Davor now. In this respect, I must say that we were making some talks in previous weeks, and basically one of the key fears would not be epidemiological situation in the world. However, the ecological situation, the spreading of Sahara, the climate changes happening in Africa, and the potential really push of people that cannot live, that cannot, in these unsustainable circumstances, if this would make a high enough pressure in Europe, we are all afraid that joined with the pressure for the economic redistribution that's happening simply right now in the rich societies, we could be facing up something like neo-fascism, like if you want to prevent the power and economic structure, you take a lot of xenophobia that's at hand, and then you make some kind of dystopian system. So Davor, what would your comment be about solidarity? And because the whole concept of humanitarian law is based on solidarity with the people in need. Now in COVID crisis, we have seen that solidarity was on a very low level, even between the people of EU, the nations of not people, but the states of EU. And it obviously shows the suboptimal system, that this Westphalian state system is not definitely the best one when it comes to the global needs. But what would you say? What would be your comment about the solidarity? What could we expect in future if something like climate changes pushes for another round of refugees?
Right. Well, many of these are first just a couple of comments related to the previous discussion and the international law. There is something paradoxical almost about international law and attempts to impose it. On the one hand, there are some noble ideas behind it, and the major one is to limit the power of the nation state and to establish some kind of order or relationships among different states in the world in order to protect and guarantee certain rights, primarily rights of individuals, but also certain rights and the way states and other subjects relate to each other. The problem there is that, of course, there is no force apart from political entities that agree to a certain extent or not to impose certain legal measures to make powerful states act this way or the other. And in that sense, a lot of those rights are more or less fictional or work as virtual real. So something that is virtual, but has power to change reality only insofar as people really believe in it, and then make, for example, certain states obey to certain rules. But of course, the problem is that you don't have any instruments to make superpowers, extremely influential big powers, states, to actually obey to any of these legal obligations, even if they formally subscribe to them, and in many cases they even don't do that. So very often, as it's the case on a national, but even more on international level, the right is subject to political power and regime of power. So the right is there to protect the weak, in theory, but very often the protection of the weak depends on the will of those who have the power or the general population to put some pressure on those instruments of power. And this is what we also see when it comes to migrant, or I prefer to call it refugee crisis, that very often now European states being affected by that go back to the idea of nation states, and then they simply say in many cases, well, there are these rights, but they are more or less abstract, and they can apply to them only insofar as they enter the soil of our state, so our sovereign state. Therefore, we want to let them enter, and therefore we are not in charge of any of this. So that logic has been applied in certain cases in European states, and very often public intellectuals, those of more conservative orientation, argue for that. And this, it really creates some serious questions about what kind of values do we want to be leading values in our societies or in the world as such. Very often we can see this conflict between the crises that affect everybody, different states and peoples in those states, and those attempts to actually respond to those crises by going back to the idea of sovereign nation states that in itself is, of course, questionable whether that's possible in the world we live in today or not.